There's a generation walking around right now that learns something most people never figure out, that the less you need, the less they can take from you. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're the ones who laugh at things that should hurt, the ones who shrug when they should cry, the ones who show up for everyone else but never seem to need anything themselves. And here's what nobody talks about. That emotional distance isn't coldness, it's architecture. It was built, brick by brick, out of necessity. It's a mighty mineral to imataise. Think about what it means to grow up in a world that keeps changing the rules on you. Not once, not twice, over and over again. Your parents told you stability was real. Then the divorce rates of the 70s and 80s proved otherwise. Your teachers told you the future was bright. Then the Cold War made it feel like everything could end on a Tuesday afternoon. Adults said work hard and you'll be rewarded. Then companies started handing out pink slips to people who'd given 30 years of their lives. Gen X didn't become emotionally guarded because they wanted to. They became emotionally guarded because the alternative was getting flattened every single time. But here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists have a term for what Gen X developed. It's called defensive pessimism. And it's not what most people think it is. Defensive pessimism isn't cynicism. It isn't giving up. It's a highly specific cognitive strategy where the brain lowers expectations in advance to protect itself from the full weight of disappointment. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that defensive pessimists actually perform better under pressure than optimists in high uncertainty environments. Because they've already mentally rehearsed the worst case, the shock is already absorbed. What looks like a bad attitude from the outside is actually a finely tuned psychological shock absorber on the inside. And it goes even deeper than that. Because defensive pessimism is only one layer of the armor. The other layer is irony. Gen X turned irony into a survival language. Crack a joke before the moment can crack you. Keep things at arm's length so nothing gets too close. Laugh it off before it has the chance to sting. This wasn't learned from a book. It was absorbed from an environment where sincerity felt dangerous, where hope had a track record of letting you down, where the adults around you talked about everything being fine, while quietly preparing for the possibility that it wasn't. When you grow up holding two contradictory truths at once, you learn to process pain sideways, through humor, through detachment, through a raised eyebrow and a dry comment that says everything without saying anything at all. Here's what most people don't realize about that irony. It's not emptiness, it's protection. There is something deeply feeling underneath it. Gen X cares. They care intensely. They just learned early that broadcasting that care made them a target, so they buried it. They became experts at showing up without making a show of it, helping without announcing it, loving without performing it. You know that friend who fixes your problem before you even finish describing it and then changes the subject? That's not indifference. That's a person who learned that actions are safer than declarations. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to get a Gen Xer to admit they're struggling? Not because they're too proud exactly, but because asking for help requires a kind of vulnerability that their nervous system was never really trained for. Research in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during stressful periods compared to other generations, not because they don't have people they could ask, but because needing something from someone else feels like handing them a piece of leverage. And Gen X has spent a lifetime keeping leverage out of other people's hands. But wait, there's a darker side to this. Because armor that was built for survival doesn't always know when to come off. The same emotional self-sufficiency that made Gen X so quietly powerful can also make intimacy feel almost physically uncomfortable. Asking for what you need, letting someone see you struggle, admitting that something actually hurt, these things require a kind of openness that directly contradicts 40 years of hard-coded wiring. It's not that Gen X doesn't want connection. It's that connection requires a kind of exposure that the whole architecture of their psychology was designed to prevent. And stay with me, because this next part changes how you see everything. There are really three distinct ways Gen X learned to carry this armor. Three patterns that show up in how they move through the world today. The first is what you might call the ironist. This is the one who deflects everything with humor. If it hurts, make a joke. If someone gets too close, say something so dry and detached that they back off instinctively. The ironist isn't mean. They're not cold. They've just learned that laughter is the safest distance between a feeling and a reaction. These are the people in your life who seem effortlessly unbothered, who shrug at things that would level other people, and who, if you ever catch them off guard in a quiet moment, show you something so raw and real that it almost doesn't fit the person you thought you knew. The second type is the invisible one. They figured out early that visibility is a liability, that the more people know about you, the more they have to use against you, so they made themselves small. Not out of shame exactly, out of strategy. They do the work without credit. They solve problems before anyone notices there was a problem. They show up without being seen, showing up. And there's a peculiar kind of power in that. Being the person in every room who knows exactly what's happening, but never needs to make it about themselves. The invisible one isn't hiding. They're just operating on a frequency most people don't know how to tune into. The third type is the quiet carrier. This is perhaps the most complex of the three. The quiet carrier holds everything. Their own weight, everyone else's weight. The unspoken agreements. The unsaid things. They don't complain. They don't explain. They just carry it. And they've carried it for so long that they've forgotten what it felt like before the weight was there. You can recognize a quiet carrier by the way they respond when someone finally asks how they're doing. There's always a pause, a slight recalibration, because nobody asks that question expecting a real answer, and they've stopped expecting to give one. Tell me in the comments, which one are you? Here's the thing that often gets missed in conversations about Gen X. The emotional armor wasn't a choice in the way we usually think of choices. It was an adaptation, a nervous system response to an environment that kept signaling that openness was costly. Psychologists call this affect regulation, the process by which the brain learns to modulate emotional responses based on environmental feedback. When the environment consistently punishes vulnerability, the brain learns to suppress it, not as a failure, as a feature, as an act of preservation so quiet and so automatic that it doesn't even feel like a decision anymore. It just feels like who you are. Think about the last time you watched a Gen Xer respond to something that would send most people into a spiral, a crisis at work, a piece of bad news, a situation that has no clean solution. There's this particular stillness they carry into it. Not numbness, not detachment, something more like a person who has already run this simulation 1,000 times and knows exactly which tools to reach for. That's not luck. That's decades of calibration. And now they're watching the world change in ways that would have seemed like science fiction when they were kids. Social media turning private life into public performance. Vulnerability becoming a brand. Authenticity becoming a strategy. All the things Gen X learned to protect are now being monetized. And they're watching it with that familiar half-raised eyebrow. Not because they don't understand it, but because they understand it too well. You're not broken if you have trouble letting people in. You're not cold if you process things sideways. You're not withholding if love for you looks like showing up rather than talking about showing up. That's not a deficiency. That's a whole language that most people just don't speak. The armor wasn't a mistake. It was the right tool for the environment it was built in. And maybe, just maybe, the question isn't how to take it off. Maybe the question is learning to choose, moment by moment, when to let it breathe. If this resonated with you, please subscribe. There's more to explore about how your mind works. I'll see you in the next one.